Everywhere we look in the Western world at the moment, specifically Britain, we can see that something terrible but inevitable is on the horizon, arguably even necessary for the reordering of our culture, so we can reset who we are and stem this seemingly unending decline. The way I think this manifests most obviously is trust in society fading, trust in institutions fading. Now, more important than that, there's a trust in the underlying mythos behind said traditions. I've seen this with my generation, I'm a millennial, I'm 38, and my parents' generation, specifically with things like COVID and other global issues. I noticed people of my generation were much more wary of trusting institutions, whether it's the NHS, the government and so on. And my parents' generation, while not all trusting those institutions, were more open to them. They thought that they were being told the truth, just implicitly, because they'd grown up in a world where, broadly speaking, you can trust the institutions. And again, it's because they hark back to a shared mythos behind it, the shared people, a homogeneity. The biggest way this is manifesting, I think, is the post-World War II consensus. It's been spoken about a lot by me and others. The idea is, of course, that there was a liberal consensus born after that. The extremes of history are over. I guess you could say that culminated in Francis Fukuyama's The End of History idea. And now we're just going to live in these happy, clappy, liberal, multicultural societies forevermore, in one big shopping mall. However, that's falling apart at the seams now. You see that with many of the once issues that you just couldn't speak about being spoken about by figures you wouldn't expect them to be. Case in point is things like Israel. You can't touch that issue for a long time. And the boomers were very hot on that, especially the conservative ones. Always don't question Israel, 100%. And if you do, you're Hitler. You're evil. You're going down the slippery slope. But just recently we had a Joe Rogan episode with this Dave Smith. He's a comic, and Douglas Murray, sort of a neocon right-wing type. And Murray really gave a very poor performance. He's very snooty, condescending, just saying, "Oh, I've been to Israel, haven't you? You should listen to me, I'm the expert," but didn't really give any substance to his points. And again, it's just more evidence of this post-World War II consensus. But most interestingly, and a lot of people have covered this, the media still came out with, especially the mainstream right media, with, "Oh, Murray smashed this guy and he's the expert you should listen to." But again, it was more, these are the official narratives we should follow. But they're increasingly being shown to be skin deep. Once you start trying to penetrate them, you realise there's not much there, but you just must believe to be a good person. Now, another one of these, I think, that has really got many people concerned is the one we get from the mainstream media a lot. The UK has always been a nation of immigrants. It's just obviously untrue. I think there was the writer of Doctor Who said recently, we have to go back into history and change the way it looked, to add in black folks and Muslims and so on, because to him that's a better world. And these are the mythologies we're supposed to believe now. And again, if you're a liberal guy or girl working in modern London in some big corporation, you probably go along with it, basically because you're taking money from the system. But people who aren't winning from the system are looking at it and thinking, I don't buy into this mythos. Adolescence is another example. The modern world can't really face what's going on with mass migration and the violence, so they want to package it in a way that suits their ideology and their worldview. White male masculinity is the problem. It's always the problem. Never ever say that's not the problem, because if you do, you're a toxic, evil bigot and a would-be rapist like Andrew Tate. But as I said before, these people will think that that's moral because they're following the moral consensus of the society. But the big question is that now the moral consensus of the society? I would say it probably isn't. And there are many different moral consensuses going on in different communities. Conservatives, liberals, new right-wingers, traditionalists, Muslims, Hindus. All sorts of people are now forming their own readings of history. And this is a big problem because, as I've been very eager to express on this channel, culture needs a mythos just like an individual needs a story. That's not very popular in our Richard Dawkins style worldview. Everything's logical in that worldview. You don't need any of that nonsense. It's all airy-fairy crap. But of course it's not. People live off a mythology of who they are. That's why we have St. George, If you're more religiously inclined, you'll obviously know the stories of Christianity, or whatever it is you believe, have a transcendent nature to them, which is, you could say, a symbol for the soul's journey out of the material into the divine, which of course to someone who's a believer is a real journey, but the mythology is still a bridge which unites that journey, the real meaning of life, to the limits of the human mind, if you will. And again, this is why we have to understand these things are incredibly deep, but modernity treats them like they're just nothing, you know? It just wants to mess them around and turn them inside out and bend everything to its will. But we have to understand, people aren't just going to change their minds quickly. You know, this is a really important thing that I don't think we understand in this day and age. I've said before, much to the chagrin of some people who watch this channel, who are on the hard right, that my wife is Eastern European, she's Ukrainian. And it was really interesting when the war started, because my wife's grandmother was one of these more Russian sympathetic Ukrainians right on the border. And when the Russians came over the border and were engaging in many of the things that happen in war, which, as you might imagine, are quite brutal, one of the most interesting things was how her grandmother struggled more with the psychological change rather than the physical violence. And that really says something key about human beings. Now, I'm sure you've all got strong opinions on Ukraine and Russia, but just try and park those and think about the human dimension here. The point was that this old lady had lived in a certain way and believed a certain mythos for a long time, and that was brutally challenged towards the end of her life. And she struggled mentally with accepting what was going on. Now, I'm not making any points. I know people have strong opinions on who's right and who's wrong. That's not about that. It's about how people struggle more psychologically with change often than physically. And this is a vital dynamic when we're understanding what's going on in the West right now. Because what we can see, I think it's been extremely cruel what's been done to the old people in Europe. Because they grew up in basically the embers of the European tradition. Then came the 60s, the socially liberal revolution, then mass migration. And they were basically told, your worldview's all crap, you're all idiots, and we're just going to laugh at you and mock you as your beloved countries and tradition get burned, you know, and aren't you stupid old people, you racist bigots. And it's really cruel what we've done to them, because it's not just we've taken their countries, we've also psychologically damaged them. When I say we, of course, I don't mean literally us. I mean the power systems that we've lived under. And again, this is the reason I'm saying this is because we have to understand the vital importance of mythologies and how they work for the individual and the culture. You know, and if you start ripping those apart, you really damage people quite badly. In fact, on the Substack of mine, someone left a really interesting thread about John Cleese. You know, we all know John Cleese, Fawlty Towers, good eye for English culture and satire. And he mocked the kind of conservative, you know, soft, quiet England. That's what he made a career on. And it's funny, he's good at it. But he did it to such an extent, it just looks stupid. You know, what we need is this modern liberal world. But Cleese has slowly woken up in realising that deep down maybe he did love that quiet conservative England. Maybe it did have something beautiful about it that's now gone forever, that you helped destroy. And now it's been replaced by what? This mass immigration, angry, aggressive liberals. Your towns and cities being eradicated, English culture being something that's largely gone. Not just due to mass immigration, but due to the, you know, material takeover of everything English. Essentially just an outpost of American capitalism now. But anyway, back to the core point. What we have to understand is a mythology is a higher order of truth. It's not literally true. It's higher than literal truth. It's why I think I said before, the famous quote that a poet is a liar who tells the truth. You know, I think it was Jonathan Swift who said it. And why it's so important to know this is because we are just in this factual world at the moment. That's all we'll listen to. But we have to understand, you know, our minds can't comprehend deeper truths that sustain a civilization. So it needs to be written into our mythologies, our stories, our poetry, our art. But when you start usurping that, as has happened in modernity, that's when you get trouble. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you know, the great critic of Soviet communism, he was in a gulag for many years, of course. You know, they said to him, what was it fundamentally that went wrong in Russia? And he said, well, we forgot about God. Now again, I'm sure in our Dawkins view, oh, isn't he stupid, man on a cloud? That's not what he means. What he's talking to is the tradition, the mythology, these deep beats which speak to who we are as a people over time. which give us a path to the transcendent, which guide our societies, our cultures, and so on. Now, this is the same thing that's happened in the West. It's just happening in a farcical way. We've got wokeness, which seems stupid, but actually corrodes us from the very inside, rather than economic communism, which is more brutal and rooted in hard power. We're more hypnotized, and being led into the fires of hell without seeing, thinking, oh, look, isn't it nice and warm? It's not going to be warm when you get a bit closer. It's going to burn us alive. But where we are now, if you're looking around in countries like the UK, but I think it's also true in other countries, is we're seeing these competing mythologies of what Britain is, of what Europe is, of what the world is. The leftist liberals see the West as evil and it has to be eradicated, and apparently that's going to produce this wonderful world of equality after everyone's going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Of course that's not going to happen, and I don't think they're even interested in that anyway half the time. What they're interested in is resentment. They want to rip the West down. A lot of them got issues to do with their father. And some of the more alien cultures who've come to the West are more than happy to jump on that gravy train because it's just an avenue for them to gain cultural power and social capital. That's why, again, the system persistently demands that we repeat diversity as a strength. But as I've explored on this channel, it's not actually about diversity at all. It's about everything being under the umbrella of liberalism. I've explored many times Christianity has been gutted out and then liberalism has been re-implemented into it. So it's a blown up system, which is essentially just a facsimile of what it once was. But its heart is just liberal nonsense. They'll just take the bits of the Bible they like where Jesus is, nice and compassionate, and Jesus was nice and compassionate at times, and they'll ignore the rest because it suits the liberal system. Now, we see this happening with other systems. Hinduism and Buddhism largely are quite easy to fit into the modern system because they're more mystical systems. The core of the religions is more maya or illusion, overcoming of worldly illusion. That doesn't really bother the elite so much. Not to mention most of the Indians and so on who come here are after money, so they're not really pushing religion anyway. It's Islam that's the big issue because that has an out-and-out political mandate. You can't deny it. It's part of the religion. It has a strong cultural mandate of how you should live. And people rightly say, well, hang on a minute, this is challenging Christian values. And again, maybe they rightly point out, well, you're not Christians, because the West isn't really Christian anymore. And half the people who say they are, they're only doing it for cultural reasons. But the point is that people sense on an intuitive level, hang on, there's a rival mythology here to our system. And they're right to sense that. The way we deal with it maybe isn't right, but we're right to sense it. And the system can see that people are noticing this, and it must come down hard on anybody who points this out. And that's why they're so defensive towards Islam. Because if people realise that Islam is a competing system, that by its very nature undermines multiculturalism and the supposed cohesion that it innately has within. So again, it's not that they're necessarily defending Islam, it's that they're defending their system through the proxy of Islam. And of course, you could argue that means Islam will have a strong position down the line anyway, but at the moment, liberalism is dominant. So what do? We have these kind of three prongs. We have traditional Western tradition, broadly Christian. Then we have Islam. Then we have liberalism itself. Now, there are many more splinter things, but I think they're the three big ones. And what are the solutions then for us? Some people promote this idea of just turning back to the old ways, just turning the clock back, remigrating people who've been here for a while. Now, I can understand the sentiment, but I think that we're missing quite a lot when we think all we need to do is just remigrate these people and turn the clock back, 40 years and everything will go back to normal. You can't go back in history. You just can't. You have to go forward. You have to learn your lessons and move on. And then, as I've spoken about many times, remigration is not going to be easy. It seems like it's really gaining ground because it's very big on places like Twitter. But in reality, in the real political scene, it's still very, very fringe. And you have to remember, they're still going to be piling people in and brainwashing kids for 10, 20 years yet. So it's going to be very, very hard to do that. But like I say, I don't think that means that hope is over necessarily. I think we have to start by realising that our foundations that made England, Europe, the way it was, have been rattled deeply. And until we realise that we've been deeply spiritually injured and we've become addicted to materialism and modern day liberal ideology, we're not really going to be able to truly grow and heal whatever we do, however much remigration you do or don't have, however much you turn back to the old ways. Because youngsters won't understand the old ways. They'll just be like, why are you making me do this? They don't understand the value of boundaries. And this is why I keep saying we have to go through the centre of hell, like Dante and Virgil. And when we go through the centre of hell, we learn the lessons therein. And that's where we're at as a culture right now. That's why I say don't fear the decline. Keep your eyes open. Go as deep into your tradition as you can. If you're religiously inclined or spiritually inclined, go to God. You will be safe in the transcendent. Wear the armour of God. And you'll have the eyes to see what's going on, and we can record these lessons. And most importantly, it's not about lecturing other people. So I'm not saying, oh, I'm right and you're wrong. It's about allowing the spirit to awaken. And right now you can see if we jump too soon, and all this sort of second religiosity stuff that you get from some of the traditionalist accounts, that's where you resort back to religion in kind of a false way, it won't work. It's got to be real and raw from the very soul, the collective soul. And these things are real. We don't think about that in this day and age because we're so embedded in modernism. But this is historically consistent. Civilizations stem from great spiritual renewal. It's how things have always gone. So while it's hard to predict exactly what the future is going to hold, and I do think there will be a reconnection with the old, but it will have to be in a new way. I think both René Guénon and right up to people like Joseph Campbell, who you could argue is semi-traditionalist, both spoke about how the East might have something to offer the West, in the sense of the return of the mystic, the re-enchantment. And we are seeing this happening. You're seeing people gravitate more towards Eastern teachings. But of course, what they recognise, just like me when I went into them, is, well, this is lacking structure. This is lacking something which holds me together and holds a civilization together. And that's because it's not from your culture. It's not from your heart and soul. But we can still learn from that mystic heart. And what I realise is when you go into the East and you discover the mystic meaning, like I said earlier, Maya illusion that you get in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, you see it's always been at the heart of the Western tradition. There's plenty of that material. But we've just pushed it away. You could argue in the sort of Protestant Revolution. Really, you could argue even Richard Dawkins is a result of Protestantism. The rebellion against the mystic, everything becomes practical and orderly. You could also argue, if I'm really to rattle on, that that's something in there to do with the Western mind, the Anglo mind specifically, which tends to be drawn towards practicality. It's maybe a flaw in us. Well, a benefit and a flaw we have to be aware of, a double-edged sword. We're great at creating things in the world, very practical. But at the same time, we can overlook sometimes the deeper essences and fall into the material. And this is why I think any reawakening that's coming perhaps will involve a return to this initiation into the sacred at the core of our culture. Again, look throughout time, you'll always find an initiation to the sacred in any culture, especially for men. Because men become the guardians of the higher order of being. And the higher order of being, you could say in Christian language, it might be love, truth, justice, these sorts of things. And the men act as the avatars through which these transcendent truths can be gifted to the civilization and the society. Now, of course, those men have to be tip-top because the dark forces will be at them. And when you corrupt those men, the society falls. But the point is they act as the guards for the boundaries of what our society is. They protect us. Some will be more military inclined, some will be more societally inclined, some to do with marriage and so on. But you get the point. And this is where I think the next key lesson is going to come. And this is where right now there's a lot of gold for us to be picking up because there are so many lessons we have to learn. And I think as we move away from our mythology, because we're going to have to now, the West is crumbling as we presently know it, and we're going to have to move into a deeper mythos. And we have plenty of rich ground there to step into, fertile ground. Whether we're talking about the roots in, Greek Platonic philosophy, early Christianity, whatever it may well be. But we have to take the lessons we've learned. And I think the main lesson we're learning right now is something like, as I've said many times, Christ's teaching about laying not up for yourself treasures on earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. I.e., be careful of all this material wealth. It corrupts you. You get lots of nice things. You get all the money. You get the ladies. You get the sports cars. But what do you get 50 years after that, you get decline. You get people who don't value the material anymore. They just want more and more and more, and they become addicted because we've lost our spiritual core. Now, there are myriad lessons like that to do with marriage, men and women, stable societies, not having mass immigration, which replaces your population. There are many lessons for us to learn. And another one of these, which I'm really eager to stress, is this idea of the dialectic. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware the dialectic is a philosophical model, largely charted back to Hegel. Marx used it as well. But the idea is you have a thesis, then that naturally creates the antithesis, and then you get the synthesis, the answer. So Marx famously said, the thesis of capitalism, that created the working class, the solution is communism. And you can see history just working this way. Of course, he wasn't right in that communism was a synthesis. It didn't work out that way. But the point is, we have to be aware of how the dialectic works. So you could say right now, we've got the thesis is liberalism. The antithesis to that is going to be historic traditionalism, and that will create the new society. Well, that may well be true, but the point I really want to get to here is we have to, as we open up to this new age, be aware of the excesses of the right as well as the left. Because the liberal left is so dominant at the moment, it's easy to criticise it. But I think as we move into perhaps a more earthy understanding of who we are, there needs to be this move towards understanding that there's a balance between left and right, and we need to get out of that dualistic way of thinking and understand that the tradition holds enough space for both the left and right, because that's the archetypal feminine and masculine. Now, the masculine should be dominant in traditionalist teaching, but it doesn't mean the feminine is meaningless. It has a role to play. It has a role in moderating the excesses of the masculine. They're supposed to dance together. And I think moving back to more of a tradition doesn't mean betraying some of the noble ideas of the left, like, justice for the oppressed. Of course, when that goes too far, it gets into wokeism and so on. But it's about limiting that in the right way. At the same time, making sure the working classes have representation, that they're not abused. That seems noble. One of the horrible things about mass immigration and capitalist modernity is the way it undercuts our own working class. I remember in London dating a girl, and she said, I'm going to go hire this Romanian fella. He's a lot cheaper than my current builder. And I remember even back then when I was a bit more like, libertarian right, thinking like that just doesn't feel right to me. Like, you should try and be loyal to the fellas that are here. If we keep just, giving our business to the lowest bidder, it's just going to undermine our own working class and destroy their living. Well, that's happened. We do need to have that consciousness for our own. It's how we build, a healthy society. So I hope it makes sense what I'm saying. It's moving out of that dualistic left-right way of thinking. Now, we won't be able to escape the dialectic totally, but it will lead us into an evolved sense of understanding of who we are in our civilization. It'll be a higher dialectic, if you will, arguably free from materialist dualism, and that's where the spiritual dimension will come in my view. But what can we do about all this? Well, I really strongly believe, and I know it's not popular, but I do believe it's consistent with traditionalist thought and transcendent thought, that we have to allow this process to happen. A lot of people seem to want war, but that's not going to solve anything. It will just make it, the liberal system will just use that against you. What we need to happen is to allow this to play out, just like in the meditative practice I've got some guys doing on the new channel. When you meditate, the idea is that you're still. And you can see the dark forces within start to pull you in. Maybe there's a pull to acting out in some unhealthy behaviour over there. Maybe there's anger inside. And you're not responding to these things. Like Christ with the devil, you're letting them pass. And that seems like weakness in the physical world. But in reality, spiritually speaking, you're actually getting more and more rooted in your true self. The world is having less of a pull on you. You're becoming free. Then, of course, you can go into the physical world and be all the more wise, responsible, and capable of acting in the right manner. Now, this doesn't mean that things aren't going to get messy. I think they are going to get messy. I think there is going to be a lot of pain. Like Jung's famous quote, the tree that grows to heaven has its roots down in hell. And you need to sometimes go into that darkness in order to give you the sustenance to understand how to grow to heaven, which direction to go in. And the soul will awaken. It will awaken within people. It just definitely will. It has to. It's a total consistency throughout history. And again, it comes to that fundamental question, which is so hard for Western man to answer. Do we dare put this in God's hands, or should it be in man's hands? I think the answer is very simple. Personally, it needs to be in God's hands, and God will work through the men that are open and are shining, and his wisdom will come through, and that will be the rebirth of the civilization. What that means is hard to say, but the change will come. But it must come in the right way. Strike too soon, or with ego or unconsciousness, it will just make a mess. Just make things 10 times harder, and it's exactly what the liberal system wants, because it allows it to maintain its authority. Hope this makes sense. Longer video today, I know, but a bit of a contemplation on a Sunday. Anyway, do consider checking out the new spiritual channel if you're interested in personal and spiritual transformation. I think that's vital at the moment. If you want to connect with me exclusively and get exclusive content, please do check out the Substack. And do let me know your thoughts below this video, and consider subscribing if you're new. Have a great day.